Antony Loewenstein joins me now from Sydney. He is an independent journalist and author of The Palestine Laboratory. He was based in occupied East Jerusalem between 2016 and 2020. Antony, fantastic to speak to you. Now, that point there, I'm very glad that you're our guest right now, because the last time we spoke, and it really stayed in my mind, you said, you know, the US sort of frames itself as helpless in front of Israel. And here we are, sort of here again. But I just wonder, and you said, who is the superpower here, right? It's America. And I remember that because we have sort of Israel here again appearing, America appearing helpless in front of the United States. Is it really?
No, is the short answer. Not at all. I mean, look, obviously the news in the last 24 hours that America seems to have withheld some bombs for Israel is a start. It's encouraging. It's important to note that the US, when they're asked about this in the last day or so, said that this is no indication that further weapons won't be sent as soon as possible. Listen, there are no red lines here. I mean, we've heard for months that Biden says there are red lines. The EU has said there are red lines. The Arab states, even Saudi Arabia, which apparently is looking towards some kind of normalization deal with Israel, which apparently might still be on the cards despite all the last 6 months. Even they put out a statement in the last 24 hours massively opposing what Israel might be doing in Rafah or continues to do in Rafah. There are no red lines because history has shown that even if Israel fully invades Rafah, what's the US going to do?
Yeah.
Cut ties, impose sanctions? They won't do so. And that doesn't matter whether Biden or Trump is in the White House. So ultimately, yes, the US seems to be unhappy with the idea of this. But the fact is, there was just a poll that came out in Israel in the last 24 hours that in October, the same poll about is Israel going to win the war, whatever that means, 74% of Israelis said yes. That number is now much under 50%. There is deep skepticism, cynicism, and frankly exhaustion that this war is going to succeed from Israel's perspective, namely destroying Hamas or even getting a lot of the hostages back home. So Netanyahu is in a bit of a bind, to put it bluntly. He's in a bit of a bind, and can the US pressure him to agree to a ceasefire and to agree to that deal brokered by Egypt and Qatar? Yes, they could. It's the question whether they will. And this idea of increasing American anger obviously goes to the US political situation and domestic politics. The US election is coming up, of course, in November. Trump is hardly some pro-Palestine candidate. He's as belligerently pro-Israel as Biden is, to be sure. But there's no doubt in many parts of the US, public opinion polls show that what's happening in Gaza is deeply affecting Biden, deeply affecting the Democrats. And that's not going to change. In fact, it's only going to get worse if Israel massively invades Rafah, and particularly with age groups 18 to 35, young Americans, not just Jews, although many Jews, but just young Americans in general, who get their information not from the mainstream media, but often from social media, TikTok, Instagram, whatever. There is a constant daily feed of accurate, ugly pictures about what's happening in Gaza. And I think it's possible that that kind of pressure could stop Israel moving forward. But it's important to note, if the war stopped today, which it won't, but if it stopped today, none of Israel's goals have been achieved. Hamas is still standing. A lot of their leadership still exists in Gaza, but also across the Arab world, mostly Qatar, but elsewhere. Yes, some hostages may be exchanged in that deal if it happens, but ultimately Hamas is still standing to live another day. And I think it's pretty clear that many Israelis who years ago thought Netanyahu was Mr. Security do not want him to remain. But it's important to note, any likely successor of Netanyahu, Yair Lapid, is one possibility. He gave an interview in the New York Times last week, and really, it could have been Netanyahu. There's no difference on these key policies. That's the problem that Israelis face. And, you know, you've said this, that, weeks ago when we spoke, and now there will be no repercussions on Israel if it goes, into a full ground invasion into Rafah. But the impact, the reaction from the region, like what would that look like? Well, in the Arab world, it's pretty clear that Arabs, Muslims, as in average people, are outraged and have been for months, including quite rare protests in parts of the Arab world. Arab elites in Jordan, Egypt, Saudi, despite what they often say publicly, I would argue would be quite happy if Hamas was obliterated. Frankly, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I think they'd be happy if they were. It's interesting, in the last few days, there's some information that some Western states in Europe, including Belgium, which has often been quite critical of Israel, is talking about cutting trade ties or even imposing sanctions. Now, Belgium is not a massively powerful state, but they're apparently, according to press reports in Israel, trying to build a small European coalition, not the EU. The EU will support Israel, but certain smaller European states to put pressure on Israel economically. Now, that is pretty unprecedented if that actually happens, of course. So, yes, the US and the UK and much of the EU will still support Israel regardless of what it does. But there is going to be ramifications. There is going to be talk of arms embargoes from some states, trade being cut, amongst other things, not just in the global south, but potentially in the heart of Europe. So Israel needs to make up for that economic loss, potentially with selling, frankly, more weapons or surveillance technology, which they've been testing in Gaza, which I write about in my book.
Yeah.
And it's pretty clear that they're really trying to sell that at arms fairs around the world.
And just the public opinion now and the student movements that we're seeing, is that going to have any bearing at all on Israel, or does it just stay contained to the universities?
Well, certainly within Israel itself, much of the student protest movement is just dismissed as anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism has been weaponized, which is absurd. But student protests, I think, not just the US, and other countries, Australia, parts of Europe, the UK, I think will continue to grow. Now, is that going to have political impact at the ballot box? Of course, I don't know that yet. But certainly in the US, where there's a US election, as we know, in a few months, there are many young Americans and older Americans who are saying, we do not care if by not voting for Biden, Trump will win. We simply refuse to vote for a President Biden who has blindly supported Israel for so long. And that could well, in certain swing states, definitely impact the US election. People could just sit out or vote for a third option instead of Trump or Biden. So the student protest movement is really unprecedented, far bigger, in fact, than even the Iraq war protests in 2002 and 2003. And I think they will have a long-term impact.
Antony, fantastic to speak to you and to get all your reflections and insight, as always. Antony Loewenstein, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.